Once upon a time, people always wondered about other smart beings. Some thought these beings were super far away, and we'd be long gone before meeting them. Some said they met them after being taken away and experimented on. Others believed we're the only smart beings ever. But guess what? We were all wrong. When I was a teenager, I admit I smoked and used drugs. My friends and I tried different ones like LSD, MDMA, DMT, and even some prescription and over-the-counter drugs. But mostly, I stuck to weed. Weed was like my social tool. It helped me meet people who were like me, just wanting to get high. One day, I met a kid named Ralph at a party, and we became fast friends. During the summer, I'd hang out at Ralph's house, which was in the middle of a forest. We rarely went inside because his parents didn't like anyone in there. Instead, we went to his barn, filled with cats that probably shouldn't have been there. His mom bred expensive cats without a permit, and they were not treated well. Despite that, we spent hours in that barn, smoking weed and cigarettes. After a few weeks, we got bored and started exploring Ralph's neighborhood for cool spots. We found some really awesome places in Ralph's neighborhood. One spot called The Ledge was on a small mountain and gave us a great view of the whole forest. It was so big that we couldn't even see where it ended. Then there were cool places like the cliffs, which were easy to understand just from their name. But my favorite spot was the old house. This old house was deserted and had lots of no trespassing signs. We figured it was okay to go there if the owner didn't know. The house had 3 stories and looked like no one had lived there for over 50 years. It was all falling apart, with broken windows, trees growing inside, and the floor and walls were in bad shape. Graffiti covered almost every part of the walls. The property around the house was pretty big, maybe a couple of acres, and thick bushes surrounded it. There was also a side building that looked like it might have been an outhouse. The whole place felt a bit spooky, like most abandoned houses do. We usually went there during the day, but I liked going at night the most. It was kind of scary, but the excitement I felt in that dark, abandoned house in the middle of the forest was unbelievable. I went there a few times alone because Ralph didn't want to go at night. One night, it was around 8 p.m., and I really wanted Ralph to come with me to the old house. But, like always, he kept saying no. This made me upset, so I asked him why he wouldn't come. He sighed and said, "Well, this might sound a bit silly, but I saw something in the forest near there." I asked, "What does that have to do with anything?" He replied, "I'm worried that it might come to the house during the night." I asked, "What might come?" He sighed again and began to tell me what happened. When he was 9 or 10, he and his friend Carl wanted to find a cool spot away from their families. After a few weeks of exploring, they found the old house, but it looked different back then. There were about 9 or 10 paths around the house covered in brush. Ralph and Carl would explore one path each time they visited until they went through all of them. Some paths took a few days because they walked slowly, enjoying the forest scenery. They left marks or piles of sticks at the farthest point they reached, so the next time they visited, they could quickly walk past what they'd already seen until they reached their checkpoint. As they explored those paths, Carl and Ralph didn't find anything super interesting to keep, but some strange things started happening. The weird stuff mainly occurred at the checkpoints, especially on the last 3 paths. The first checkpoint had sticks tied together with long pieces of grass. They came back the next day excited, but the sticks were now in a messy pile. They thought maybe a fox or another animal did it, but Ralph later said it couldn't have been an animal that made the sticks look like that. The second checkpoint had 4 sticks in a square pattern. Carl was away for a few days, and when he returned, they found 3 more squares of sticks, making a big square. It made them feel uneasy, but they continued down the path, and nothing else strange happened. They explored the last path all in one day. During the day, they made a star in the ground with a stick. Eager to finish, they made a plan to meet at the old house exactly at midnight. Carl brought 2 flashlights, and Ralph brought 2 pocket knives from his dad. Everything went as planned, and they started down the path at midnight. Ralph and Carl soon found out that the paths at night were not as nice as they seemed during the day. It was kind of scary, but neither of them wanted to admit it because they wanted to be brave. When they got to the checkpoint, they used their flashlights and saw something that made them gasp. Right next to the original star they drew in the ground was another star, but it looked like a messy drawing a 2-year-old would make. The worst part was it was at least an inch deep and half an inch in diameter. At first, Carl wanted to go back home, but Ralph convinced him not to. Ralph thought that someone might have seen them leaving the old house's property after the 6th trail. This person was messing with their checkpoints to scare them away and keep them off the property. Carl thought Ralph might be right, so they kept going to finish the path. This path was longer than the others, and as they went deeper, things got weirder. Some trees had deep cuts, almost splitting them in half, and some were knocked over. These strange things became more common the further they went. Then they arrived at a circle-shaped clearing, about 100 yards across. There was no grass and only one tree in the middle, with a tower built into it. They named it the Watchtower because of its structure. The watchtower was made of wood and was about 4 stories tall. On the bottom floor, there was a big doorway. The second floor had a balcony with no railing, and the third floor had what looked like a window. The fourth floor was like a roof, maybe with stairs or a ladder going up, and it had something like a railing around it. They didn't notice the fourth floor at first because it looked like a flat roof from below. But then they saw it, a tall creature standing on top. It was looking the other way, and it was hard to see its features in the darkness. They stood still, staring at the creature for what felt like a long time. The forest was so quiet that they heard the ringing noise your brain makes when there's no other sound. After a few minutes, the creature started moving on top of the watchtower. It raised its hand, like it was stretching, and that's when they saw something really scary. The creature had claw-like fingers, but not like regular claws. The sharp part was on the back of the fingers, and the other side was dull. The claws were also opposable and about 10 inches long. Ralph kept quiet, but Carl couldn't hold back his scream. As soon as Carl made a noise, Ralph jumped on him and tackled him to the ground. He covered Carl's mouth and signaled him to be quiet by putting a finger to his own lips. When they looked back at the creature, it was staring right at them. Their hearts stopped, and they held their breath, trying not to move. Luckily, the darkness made them invisible to the creature. It started looking around, like it was searching for where the noise came from. They also saw another silhouette of the creature in the 3rd-story window. Suddenly, the creature jumped off the roof, making a loud bang and raising a cloud of dust. Ralph and Carl knew they had to run. They sprinted as fast as they could, hoping the creature didn't see or hear them. After about 10 minutes, they stopped. Ralph was almost ready to collapse, but Carl helped him down gently. They sat there in complete silence, listening and catching their breath. The forest seemed to go back to normal, with the usual sounds of wildlife. After a few minutes, they walked home without saying a word to each other. I didn't know what to say after hearing all that. It sounded unbelievable, and at first, I thought Ralph was just telling a made-up story. I sarcastically commented on it being a nice story, but the look in his eyes convinced me it was real. I asked about Carl, and sadly, he moved across the country soon after. They stayed friends for a couple of years, but over time, they lost contact. After that, we went to sleep, but it was hard to get much rest. We didn't talk for a few days, but eventually, things went back to normal. After a few weeks, I suggested going back to the watchtower to clear things up. At first, Ralph said no, but with some convincing, he said maybe. I suggested bringing a gun or 2 and some knives to be smart about it. That made him feel better, and he agreed, but we needed more people. We called some friends and planned to go the next weekend. Sleep was tough over the next week. I had nightmares about the watchtower and those creatures. Most of the dreams have been forgotten, or maybe my brain blocked them out. But there was one horrible dream I couldn't forget. In the dream, I was one of those creatures. I stood on top of the watchtower, hungry, scanning the forest for something to eat. I heard a noise, and I looked into the dark woods. It was hard to see with my non-human eyes. Maybe it moved, I thought, and started looking around. Nothing. I climbed down the ladder behind me. In my dream, I saw the silhouette of one of those creatures standing and staring out the window. It made me feel uneasy because I realized something was not right about what I was. I went down the ladder past the second floor until I reached the first floor. Strangely, the ladder kept going down underground. I hesitated but went down into complete darkness. I kept going down until I saw a light below me. It got closer, and just as I was about to see what it was, I woke up sweating. Not feeling well, I went to the bathroom and threw up. A week passed, and we all met up at Ralph's house. I brought 2 friends, John, a bodybuilder, and Austin, a good friend. Ralph only got 1 friend, Mark, a wrestler, to join us. Each of us brought something helpful for the adventure. John brought a backpack with water and food. Austin took his dad's .44 Magnum with enough bullets. Mark brought an old machete, and Ralph took his dad's shotgun with 40 bullets. We left for the old house at 8 in the morning, wanting to face those things during the day. But when we got there, we realized our plan had a flaw. The path didn't exist anymore. Luckily, Mark had a machete, so he started cutting through the brush. We were worried the whole path would be covered, but it was only for about the first 100 or 150 feet. After that, there was no more brush, just grass. We walked for an hour when Austin started complaining, saying it was pointless. Ralph assured him we would find something. I asked if it was the right path since we hadn't seen anything strange yet. Ralph said, "I think so." "You think?" John rolled his eyes. "Well, I think it's time to eat something." "I agree, I'm starving," Mark added. We sat down and ate. While eating, I looked around and noticed something odd. It was noon, and the sun lit up everything except under the trees. I saw a part of a tree bulging out. Walking closer, I realized what it was. "What are you doing?" asked Mark. "Just come here, guys," I said with a serious look on my face. As they walked over, they noticed it too. On the tree was one of the claw marks Ralph told me about. There were 4 claws that caused it, each about 1.5 inches or 2 inches deep and about 1 inch across. There was a long silence as we all stared at the claw marks on the tree, trying to make sense of what we saw. Austin finally spoke up. "Well, I guess this is the right path." "Told you," Ralph said. "I'm worried now," John admitted. "Don't be. If we come across one of these creatures, I'll blow its head off." "But what if our guns and knives aren't enough?" John asked. "Well, I highly doubt that, but I guess we would just run for our lives," replied Mark. We kept going down the path, this time with our weapons ready. We saw more scratch marks on the trees. The tension grew as we walked, and we all talked less. I looked at my friends occasionally to make sure they were okay. Everyone, except Ralph, had fear in their eyes. Ralph looked regretful and terrified. After what felt like hours of walking, we saw an opening ahead, and in the blurry distance, we could make out the watchtower. "Oh," Ralph whispered with a scared voice. "What?" I nervously asked. "We gotta get out of here now." "Why? What's wrong?" Austin asked. "The watchtower has at least doubled in size since I was last here." I stepped back towards Ralph, and then I heard a loud snap. Suddenly, I was stuck in a net, swinging violently. I hit my head on a tree and got knocked out. One reason we have fears of things like monsters is because our brains are wired to be scared in uncertain situations. Imagine cavemen sitting around a fire, hearing a noise in the bushes. One guy gets scared and grabs a spear, another ignores it as just the wind, and one guy decides to give whatever's there a hug. If there's a dangerous tiger, some guys might survive better than others. Our brains are wired to react to uncertain situations with fear, like thinking, "Oh no, oh no, oh nope nope nope." Without a clear reason for fear, our minds fill in the blanks with scary things. A seemingly safe situation can feel uncertain with just a little push. For example, walking down a dark hallway may not bother you most of the time, but after reading spooky stories, suddenly it feels like a potential threat, making your heart race. Even silly chain letters can create a sense of unease, making people share them despite knowing they're dumb. But if the fear of monsters is just an overgeneralized response, why do we keep telling and spreading stories about them? Shouldn't we try to minimize these unnecessary byproducts of our survival instincts, like removing wisdom teeth or an appendix? On the other side, things got really strange. One corner was blocked off like a big cubicle. The opposite side had big containers, kind of like an 8-foot filing cabinet with just one drawer instead of many. A door along the back wall didn't have a doorknob, and in front of it were markings that seemed like footprints from another creature. Tubes hung from the ceiling in a weird pattern. I heard voices from the cubicle direction, and slowly, they got louder, like there was tension building. The voices started sounding mean, almost like the creatures were having a big argument, yelling and stomping. The stomping was scary. Each stomp shook the whole room, so I knew the creature had to be really big. They argued for what felt like hours until one of them left the cubicle. I felt sick when our eyes met. The creature was horrifying, 8 feet tall, super muscular, and looked like a humanoid. Its skin was thick, like leather but a darker pink, not quite red. One leg was as thick as a car tire and about 4 to 4.5 feet long. The feet were almost human but much larger, with small versions of the claws Ralph described instead of toes. Its torso was oddly small, but the arms were long, hanging down to its knees. The worst part was the claws instead of fingers, just like Ralph described, but I could see they were a whitish yellow, like teeth, probably made of bone. The thing that scared me the most was its face. Even now, it gives me nightmares. Its head was like a human's, but the mouth had long fangs hanging out, and it had several rows of them. The tongue was flat like a human's, but it didn't have a nose. Instead, there were holes like a snake's nostrils. It didn't have ears, just holes with some kind of filter. The hair looked like ropes, each one a single piece. But the scariest part was its eyes. Instead of white, its eyes were mostly black, with a thin white iris and red pupils in the center. I called them wolverines because of their claws. After throwing up, I looked up, and the wolverine smiled at me, sending a shiver down my spine. It stopped and we stared at each other for about 5 minutes before it turned around and ran back into the cubicle. More wolverines walked out, all with the same disturbing smile. One of them said something to me, repeating it 3 or 4 times. Not sure what to do, I said I didn't understand. It frowned and walked towards the door. The wolverine stood where the footprints were, the door flew open, and all 3 wolverines walked out. I was alone in there for a long time, trying to find a way out at first, but there was no exit. I gave up and started thinking about my friends, Ralph, Austin, John, and Mark. Where were they? Were they okay? Did they get caught too? Who managed to escape? Are they still alive? All these thoughts made me cry hard for about 30 minutes. Then, I realized crying wouldn't help. It wouldn't get me anywhere, and it would only make me thirsty. What if they didn't give me water? It would make things worse. After a few hours, some wolverines came back with a table and straps. They opened the door, and I groaned, expecting the worst. They picked me up carefully, like a mom with its baby, which confused me until I realized they were treating me like evidence, handling me carefully. They laid me on the table and strapped me in. They opened the door, and we went through a weird hallway that looked like an asylum. We ended up in a room that I could only call an operating room. The 2 wolverines talked for a couple of minutes, and then they started marking my body where they were going to cut. One wolverine had a knife and made a cut on my forehead and my right arm. The other wolverine called him, and he put the knife down next to my hand. This was my chance to escape. I quickly looked around for a way out. The door wouldn't work, but I noticed a bigger hole in the corner of the room. I grabbed the knife and started cutting the restraint on my right hand. I kept looking up to make sure they weren't paying attention, and luckily, they weren't. The first restraint took the longest, but the rest only took a second. I was free, at least from the restraints. I got up quietly and crawled towards the hole when I heard a scream. It was so loud that for a moment, I thought I went deaf. The scream disoriented me, and I couldn't move. After a moment, I composed myself while one wolverine started running towards me. I couldn't make a run for the hole because the wolverine would catch me before I reached it. I still had the knife, so I did the only thing I could think of. I threw it straight at the wolverine, hitting it in the head. The knife was sharp, but the creature's thick skin only let it go in a little bit. Luckily, it stunned the beast for a moment. I quickly turned around, got to the hole, and jumped down. I barely fit in the hole, so as I fell, I kept hitting the walls. I dropped about 50 feet until I splashed into water or some liquid. It had a strong current, dragging me along with it. Luckily, the water was only a few feet deep, so I didn't drown. After about 15 minutes, I saw light ahead in the direction I was going. Happiness filled me as I got closer and closer to the light. Finally, I got out of the cave or whatever it was and found myself in sunlight. I quickly climbed out of the water onto the riverbank and lay down, soaking up the sunlight. I ended up falling into a deep sleep right there on the shore. When I woke up, I was in my bed, all warm and cozy. Feeling content, I got up and went to take a shower. The hot water felt amazing, cleansing every pore in my body. The kitchen was right above the bathroom, so I could smell what my mom was cooking. She was making eggs and bacon this morning, and the delightful smell wafted into the bathroom. I finished my shower, dried off, got dressed, and went upstairs for a fantastic breakfast. That morning, we had a family breakfast, something we rarely did. My dad shared elaborate stories about his childhood memories, bringing joy to each person in my family. My mom talked about her job and how she got a raise, which meant positive changes for us. My sister chatted about meeting an amazing guy and how she thought he might be the one. I rolled my eyes and laughed as I cleaned my plate. All of a sudden, I heard glass breaking from the basement. My dad whispered urgently, "Go upstairs, lock yourselves in your room, and don't make a noise." We all did what he said, but I went a bit further and hid inside my closet. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening closely to figure out what was happening downstairs. All I could hear was banging, which made me scared. Something started coming upstairs, and it sounded bigger than my dad. I held my breath, curled up in a ball, as it approached my room. It seemed like whatever it was had taken my door right off the hinges. It walked towards my closet and opened the door. I stared right into the eyes of a wolverine with a huge smile on its face. The monster grabbed me and threw me against the wall. That's when I woke up. When you first wake up, you're usually really confused, especially after a dream. That's how I felt as I flew through the air. I didn't understand what was happening until I hit the tree. The moment I hit the tree was the moment I collapsed. I spat out a lot of blood and looked up. A wolverine, about 30 feet away, was staring at me with the same grin as the one in the dream. My adrenaline started rushing, but it wasn't much help because I couldn't even stand. The creature slowly walked towards me, making a noise that I could only describe as laughter. I looked around desperately, trying to find a way to escape when I noticed the river about 5 feet away. I rolled into it as the current took me with it. As I floated down the river, I saw the creature quickly jump into it, trying to chase after me. I tried to swim with the current to make myself a bit faster, but it didn't help much. The further down the river I went, the closer the beast got to me. At one point, it swung its claw towards me but missed. While its claw was right by my leg, I quickly used all the strength in my body to force myself further away. Let's just say it didn't really work. Somehow, it countered it, grabbing my ankle and flinging me into the air further down the river, which I noticed turned into a lake. I crashed down in shallow water on the opposite side of where the river came out. I knew this was the end for me. Both my legs had to be broken at this point, and the same with one of my arms. The creature got dumped out into the lake, but something surprising happened. The creature flailed its arms in every direction, filling the air with that dreaded scream. I was very confused at first, but then it hit me like a ton of bricks. It couldn't swim. It was drowning in the deep part of the water. I was filled with relief until I lost consciousness, most likely due to blood loss. I slowly opened my eyes and realized I was in a hospital bed. Looking down at my body, I noticed I was almost completely covered in bandages, while both my legs and one of my arms were in casts. My mom was sleeping on a chair they had placed next to my bed. I smiled and said her name probably about 5 times until she woke up. I don't think I've ever seen my mom cry so hard or heard her scream so loud. The police asked me a lot of questions over the next few days about what had happened. I didn't really know what to say, so I made up a story about how me and a friend went exploring down the river when I fell in, hit my head, and passed out in the river. Then, they asked which friend, and I said Carl. Apparently, Carl had been missing for a couple of days now, way before I passed out in the river. I became the main suspect in his disappearance, but there was a lack of evidence to actually convict me. Recovery would take me years to become a fully operable human being again. In fact, they actually had to replace a few bones in my legs to get them to work like normal. One thing to this day still makes me very curious. What happened to Austin, Mark, and John? Did they go crazy? Maybe they just kept quiet about it. Or did they even get captured too? Honestly, who knows, but I can only assume they were probably captured too. Whenever you're in a forest and see a strange structure that doesn't look quite so normal, please get out of there. The Wolverines are probably there, and they have no mercy. They are way more powerful than us humans. If for some reason you do come across one of them, though, find some nearby deep water and jump right in. Don't worry, you can swim, and they can't. Well, that is unless they've learned how to swim since then.